Nobody in Miller's Creek believed a broke widow and a dozen goats could ever be worth $200,000. They laughed at her. They complained about her. They tried to shut her down. But by the end of this story, every single one of them would be standing in line, begging her for a favor. This is the story of Carol Ann Whitfield and the goats that changed everything. Carol Ann was 54 years old when her husband passed. He died on a Tuesday morning, out in the barn, doing chores like any other day. One minute he was fine. The next, he was gone. There was no warning, no goodbye. Just silence, and an empty pair of work boots by the back door that she couldn't bring herself to move for almost a year. She woke up the next morning to 11 acres of land, a mortgage she didn't know existed, and 6 goats that nobody wanted. Her neighbors expected her to sell the land within a year. Small farms like hers were disappearing all across the county. Land developers were already circling, offering just enough money to make grieving widows say yes. 2 men in suits showed up at her door less than a month after the funeral. They smiled a lot. They talked about moving forward and letting go of the burden. They offered her a number that would have solved every financial problem she had. But Carol Ann said no. She didn't know exactly why. She just knew she wasn't ready to let go of the only thing her husband had left behind. So she stayed, and she kept the goats. At first, it seemed harmless, just a woman and some animals trying to get by. But goats are loud, goats are curious, and goats do not respect fences. Within 3 months, Carol Ann's goats had eaten her neighbor's prize-winning rose bushes. They'd escaped twice and wandered into the middle of Miller's Creek's only intersection. And one particularly ambitious goat named Biscuit had somehow ended up on the roof of the Baptist church. The complaints started slow. Then they didn't stop. Her neighbor, a retired school teacher named Darrell Hutchins, started a petition. She went door to door, telling everyone the goats were a public menace. She said Carol Ann was letting the whole town go to ruin. Some neighbors signed just to be polite. Others genuinely believed it. Within 2 weeks, Darrell had over 40 signatures, and she made sure everyone in town knew it. At the next town meeting, Darrell stood up in front of nearly 60 people and said something Carol Ann would never forget. She said, "Some people just aren't fit to run a farm alone." The room went quiet. Carol Ann sat there, feeling every eye turned toward her. She didn't say a word back. She just stood up, walked out, and drove home in silence. That night, she sat on her porch steps, staring at the goats grazing in the moonlight. She thought about selling. She thought about giving up. She thought about proving Darrell right. Her hands were shaking when she picked up her phone to call the developers back. She had the number typed out. Her thumb hovered over the call button for almost a full minute, but something in her wouldn't let her quit. She set the phone down, walked out into the field, and sat with the goats until the sun came up. The next morning, Carol Ann did something nobody expected. She started reading. Not books about giving up, books about goats. Real books, thick ones, about breeds and milk production, and something she'd never heard of before. Something called fiber goats. She learned that a certain breed, one she already had 2 of without even realizing it, produced a rare kind of wool, not ordinary wool, a soft, luxurious fiber that high-end designers paid enormous amounts of money for. It was called cashmere. Most people in Miller's Creek didn't even know what cashmere was, let alone that it came from goats just like the ones grazing in Carol Ann's backyard. She stayed up 3 nights straight, researching everything she could find. She learned how to comb the fiber properly. She learned which mills would process raw cashmere into usable material. She learned that 1 pound of processed cashmere could sell for more than an entire month of her late husband's paycheck. It felt impossible, but she had nothing left to lose. So Carol Ann started combing her goats by hand every single morning before sunrise. Slow, careful strokes, gathering the soft undercoat fiber, 1 goat at a time. It took hours. Her hands cracked and bled in the cold. But she kept going. Some mornings her fingers were so stiff from the cold that she couldn't hold a coffee cup afterward. She wrapped them in old dish towels and kept combing anyway. She sent her first small batch of raw fiber to a processing mill 3 states away, nervous the entire time that she'd wasted money she didn't have. For 19 days, she checked the mailbox every single afternoon. Nothing came. She started to believe she'd made a terrible mistake. Then, on the 20th day, a package arrived at her door. Inside was the finished product. Soft, pale gray cashmere, spun into yarn so fine it felt like touching a cloud. Carol Ann sat at her kitchen table and cried. For the first time since her husband died, she felt something other than grief. She felt possibility. She posted photos online describing her small batch of American-raised cashmere. She didn't expect much, maybe a few sales to cover her expenses. Within 48 hours, her inbox exploded. A boutique yarn shop in Portland wanted an order. A fashion student in New York wanted to feature her farm in a design project. A small luxury clothing brand reached out, asking if she could scale production. Word started spreading through online farming communities. People began calling her goats the Vermont Cashmere Herd, even though she lived nowhere near Vermont. Carol Ann laughed the first time she saw that. She didn't correct anyone. She just kept combing. Back in Miller's Creek, people started noticing something strange. Trucks Carol Ann had never seen before began pulling into her driveway. Delivery vans, visitors with cameras, a journalist from a regional magazine asking to do a feature story. Darrell Hutchins watched all of this from her porch across the road, arms crossed, saying nothing. Within 8 months, Carol Ann had grown her herd from 6 goats to nearly 40. She hired 2 local teenagers to help with combing and daily care. She built a small processing shed behind her barn. She started selling directly to designers instead of just wholesale mills, tripling her profit margins. One of those teenagers, a shy 16-year-old named Josh, told her one afternoon that his own family had lost their farm 2 years earlier. He said working with her goats was the first time he'd felt like farming still had a future. Carol Ann had to walk into the barn so he wouldn't see her cry. Around that same time, a designer from a small luxury label in Chicago drove 4 hours just to see the farm in person. She wanted to know if the story was real or just clever marketing. She walked the field for almost 2 hours, asking Carol Ann question after question. At the end of the visit, the designer sat on the porch steps and admitted something. She said most of the wool in the fashion industry came from massive overseas operations, faceless and disconnected from any real story. She said customers were starting to ask where things came from and who made them. She told Carol Ann that her farm wasn't just selling fiber, it was selling truth. That visit turned into a standing order and, eventually, into a small line of sweaters that featured Carol Ann's name stitched quietly into the tag. By the end of the first year, her farm had brought in over $60,000. By the second year, it was closer to $200,000. People who once complained about her goats were now asking to buy her fiber for their grandchildren's sweaters. Local business owners who had ignored her for months suddenly wanted to feature her products in their shops. And then, something happened that nobody in town expected. Darrell Hutchins showed up at Carol Ann's front door. Carol Ann almost didn't answer. Part of her wanted to slam the door in her face, but she opened it anyway. Darrell stood there, hands nervously clasped together, and said she needed help. Her granddaughter was starting a small business selling handmade knitwear, and she desperately needed a reliable, high-quality fiber supplier. She swallowed her pride and asked Carol Ann for a favor. Carol Ann stood there for a long moment, silent, remembering that town meeting, remembering the humiliation, remembering every single person who doubted her. For a second, she thought about saying no. It would have been easy. It would have felt fair, even. But then she looked past Darrell at a young girl standing nervously by the car, clutching a sketchbook full of designs. Something about that girl reminded her of herself, standing in her kitchen, holding a package of cashmere for the very first time. Then she said something that surprised even herself. She said, "Come inside, let's talk." She didn't do it because she forgave everything. She did it because she understood something Darrell never had, that success isn't about proving people wrong. It's about becoming so undeniable that being right doesn't even matter anymore. Today, Carol Ann's farm supplies fiber to boutique designers across the country. Her cashmere has been used in runway collections. Tourists drive from 3 counties over just to see her goats and buy her products directly from the farm. The same neighbors who once signed a petition against her now proudly tell visitors, "That's our local cashmere farm. We always knew she had something special." Carol Ann just smiles when she hears that. She knows the truth. Nobody believed in her. Nobody except her. And a small herd of goats nobody else could see the value in. Sometimes she still walks out to the field at sunrise, the same way she did on that first difficult morning. She combs the goats slowly, watching the sun rise over the same hills her husband used to watch. And every single time, she feels the same quiet thought settle over her. Last spring, a young mother from 2 towns over showed up unannounced, holding a toddler on her hip. She said she'd just lost her husband too, and someone told her about Carol Ann's farm. She didn't ask for advice. She just wanted to see it, to prove to herself that starting over was actually possible. Carol Ann walked her through the field for almost an hour, showing her the goats, the shed, the small processing table where it all began. Before the woman left, Carol Ann pressed a small skein of raw cashmere into her hands and told her to keep it somewhere she'd see it every day. She said it wasn't about the wool. It was a reminder that something soft and valuable can grow out of the hardest years of your life, if you're willing to stay long enough to find it. If this story moved you, if you believe people deserve a second chance to prove themselves, make sure you're subscribed, because we share stories just like this one every single week. Stories about ordinary people who refuse to give up. Stories that remind us sometimes the thing everyone else calls worthless is exactly what changes your entire life.